President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. And as a full disclosure, the World Affairs Council Town Hall have no role in encouraging Prigozhin to attempt a coup on Moscow to beat the attendance of this event. We're so happy that happened because we're on pins and needles for today's program. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Colin Clarke. He's the Director of Research at the Soufan Group, and Alyssa Demus, who is our moderator. She's an international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation, and we'll have a Q&A opportunity in about 35 minutes, so at that point we'll bring the microphone around to you and just raise your hand. Thanks everyone. Alyssa, turning it over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having us today. We really appreciate it. I thought given the exceptionally quick pace of events over the weekend, it would be really helpful to kind of set the scene and do a little quick recap of where things stand as of midnight last night. I'm also convinced that you guys have a direct line to Prigozhin and his band of merry men, so I don't know that I believe you. So all jokes aside, given the dramatic events, if we're to believe the authenticity of the audio released yesterday, which is capturing Prigozhin's first post-coup remarks, the PMC boss is alive. We don't know if he's well, but his whereabouts are currently unknown. Some speculation that he's in Belarus, some sightings of him in an upscale hotel there.
With no windows.
With no windows and lots of tea.
Yeah.
So he claimed that the purpose of his so-called March for Justice was the preservation of the Wagner Group, which his rival Defense Minister Shoigu had been attempting to subsume under the MOD as probably a week before that. Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, reportedly still have their jobs, despite Prigozhin's demands for their removal. And Shoigu was spotted yesterday in a meeting with Putin and the other heads of the country's power ministries, clad in a business suit, not in his typical military uniform, which may or may not be significant. We have yet to see. Putin has emerged from the crisis at the helm of the country, but not unscathed. Wagner's theatrics have revealed the brittleness of the system that Putin has constructed and its reliance on the loyalties of his minions. And as for the fate of the Wagner Group, this is something that I'd like to discuss with Colin Clarke, Dr. Clarke. And as for Prigozhin, in the words of a colleague, I would probably not issue him a life insurance policy in the next couple of months. So we'll see, though, how that pans out. So with that, Colin, I'll first ask, how did we get here? And can you speak a little bit about the Wagner Group's founding, its evolution, explain a little bit about the ex-con turned mercenary boss at its helm, and really unpack the mechanics behind the group's shadowy business ventures?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming today and for all the help in arranging this talk. I think my membership to the deep state has paid for itself by being able to rearrange events for the timeliness of this. So how did we get here? We got here, this is, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 22 is actually the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, right? This is the second, a lot of people forget that. They've been there since 2014, which really kind of necessitated the origin story of the Wagner Group. Although I think, what I've paid most attention to has been Wagner's activities actually outside of Ukraine. Both 2014, 2022, but I'm a Middle East specialist, mostly working on jihadi groups for a very long time. And I came across Wagner through my work on Syria and Libya. That's how I started initially tracking this group. So different footprint, different posture in the Middle East. Wagner relies pretty heavily on MOD in those situations, much less so in Ukraine, where we've seen this real fissure between Prigozhin, between the upper reaches of the Russian military, including Shoigu and including Gerasimov. And this has been building for some time. If you look at these videos that Prigozhin has released, these kind of invectives and diatribes against individuals he feels are A, holding back ammunition and weapons from Wagner, and B, stealing the limelight, stealing the valor of the Wagner group for the limited gains that the Russians have made on the battlefield. And those gains have been quite limited. I think it reached a tipping point in Bakhmut when Wagner really kind of bled out on the battlefield. And again, this is a group that's changed considerably because of the manpower needs in Ukraine. They've gone into Russian prisons, they've gone into Russian jails, and they're taking out conscripts. And it's a really dystopian picture, not only because they're forcing people to fight from jails, but some estimates say about a third of males in Russian prisons have either HIV or hepatitis, and they're actually fighting in exchange for medicine just to stay alive in some of these cases, in addition to their kind of meager salary. But they're used as cannon fodder in this meat grinder, and that can't really contribute to high morale on the Russian side to see these people being led to slaughter. But at the same time, it's changed the dynamics of Wagner itself, where it's no longer viewed as this kind of elite vanguard, but a combination of folks that were elite at one time or still are, and this kind of glomming on of people that have been let out of prisons, right? And so I think Wagner's at an inflection point, particularly so right now, about what is it going to be, who is it going to report to, and I think that's kind of where we are right now, where we've still got expeditionary operations in sub-Saharan Africa. They're still propping up dictators and military juntas in places like Mali and the Central African Republic, but there's very much this crisis on the home front after this aborted mutiny of, who are these guys loyal to? Is it Prigozhin? Is it Putin? Is it someone else? But very much Russia still needs them. They're addicted to mercenaries, and they're not going to be able to break that addiction easily.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So for much of Wagner Group's history, until relatively recently, Dmitry Utkin, a longtime mercenary with the nom de guerre Wagner, after which the group is allegedly named.
Many Nazi tattoos.
Yes, with really great, not so great tattoos. Really served publicly as the figurehead for the organization, and it wasn't really until probably 6 or 8 months ago that we saw, once the video was released of him being Prigozhin recruiting in prisons, that he really came out and acknowledged his role as the leader of the Wagner Group. So can you talk a little bit about what we know about the other mechanisms of management of the Wagner Group, and then how it ties into Concord and the broader sort of network of companies that currently exist? We know yesterday that in his video, Wagner had mentioned that he consulted with the Council of Generals, with the Council of Leaders, before actually embarking on the coup. And so I'm curious about what we know about the dynamics there.
So let me say this first about recruiting from prisons, right? And it's not even really recruiting, it's forcibly conscripting these individuals who have very few options, right? Let's put it that way. But to me, so let me take one step back. We went from this period of 20 years of fighting against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right, what we call the global war on terrorism, which was very poorly named, but that's besides the point, to this pivot from, we're no longer doing counterterrorism, we're now engaged in what we call great power competition. And in that phrase, we would say great power competition with China and Russia, right? And I propose that any country that has to conscript felons and convicts to serve in their military is by definition not a great power. That's not what we're looking at here. If we're talking about great powers, we're talking about the US and China. Russia is now a junior partner to China in very many ways. Moreover, if you've seen the way the Russians have performed or frankly underperformed on the battlefield in Ukraine, right, this is not a great power. So I want to stop including them as this kind of third leg of the stool in conversations about great power competition. I think when you look at their demographics, when you look at all these other aspects of Russian society, this is the furthest thing from a great power. So there's that part of it. Yes, this is a country with many, many nuclear weapons and a lot of energy reserves. Somebody said it's Venezuela with nukes, and I don't know if I'd want to denigrate the Venezuelans like that, but I get the analogy, right? to go back to what, it's almost a question of what is Wagner, right? People say it's a mercenary group, it's a PMC or a PSC, a private military company or a private security contractor. I view it as a conglomerate, actually. I think it's a global enterprise that definitely has military components, but it's also got the ability to extract resources. It controls mines in Africa, gold, diamonds, controls oil installations and gas installations. It has the ability to help the Kremlin evade sanctions, right, by moving these resources through different parts of the world. We know that a lot of the gold from Sudan is routed through United Arab Emirates, and that helps them with sanctions evasion. And just today, or just yesterday, I think it's really kind of hitting the news cycle today in the US, Vladimir Putin, basically came out and said, we fund Wagner, okay? Basically admitting what everybody already knew. He came out and said it's the budget of the Russian Ministry of Defense. So Prigozhin actually controls no assets himself, right? These aren't his weapons. These aren't his vehicles. These come from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And now Putin is essentially reclaiming those. Where does Wagner fit into this afterward? That's the million-dollar question. It's a question the New York Times just put to me. I'm working on a piece at the moment of trying to figure out what is this next step? What happens if Wagner ceases to exist, if it's dissolved, if it's disarmed, and there's some reporting that the Russians are now taking back heavy weaponry. But I still think that it's an essential part of Russian foreign policy, and so it's not as simple as saying, be gone, right? The Russians still need to conduct these operations. And again, Wagner's not a one-trick pony. It actually functions more like a Swiss Army knife. It can do a lot of different things. It can do offensive combat operations. It engages in disinformation campaigns, including election meddling in Madagascar. It's advised governments on how to respond to protests at home. So it really kind of runs the gamut, or has a broad spectrum in what's become an increasingly diversified portfolio of activities. This is not just an entity that's expendable. The Kremlin needs it and is going to use it in some way or another, whether these individuals are folded into the Russian military or they come under the banner of another Russian PMC, as it were. The one last thing I'll say about if these guys are folded into the Russian military and kind of reflagged, to me that drastically changes Russian military posture around the world, because the Wagner Group has been credibly accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. If it's now the Russian military that's seen to be doing these things in Mali, in Kar, in other parts of the world, I think it makes Russia even more of an international pariah than it already is, right? It's already existing within this rogues gallery of nations, the Irans of the world, Syria, North Korea. That's their club, Belarus, right? If you look at kind of who cast their lot with the Russians, if we get into a dynamic where it's now Russian military on the ground that are slaughtering, African civilians in the name of access to mines, I think that's kind of a fundamentally different thing that we're talking about.
So I want to pick up on something that you said. You'd mentioned that Putin came out in the last 24 hours and said, we fund Wagner. But in some ways, Wagner also funds the Kremlin or MOD operations. We've heard about, and you study the operations, not only in the Central African Republic, but other African nations, Middle East and North Africa. So can you talk a little bit about those dynamics and how the money flows sort of both ways?
That's a great point, and I think that's absolutely true. So Wagner will come in, and they're brought in specifically because there's no strings attached, right? People will say, well, in this power vacuum, why is Russian influence predominate the United States? Why is it the U.S. going in here and dealing with these African nations and not even allowing the Russians to get a chance? Well, for starters, we have something called Leahy laws, Leahy vetting, right, where we're not allowed to work with foreign militaries that are known to committed human rights abuses. These countries look to Russia because Russia is not going to question them on what's happening in their own country, right? In fact, they're bringing the Russians in, the Wagner Group, in to conduct, in many cases, a scorched earth type, draconian, very heavy-handed counterinsurgency campaign against rebels, jihadist groups, tribes, clans, etc. Now, Wagner comes in there, they do that, they prop up these warlords and military juntas, so they provide regime security to make sure that these individuals can maintain power, and in exchange, they get access to various mines, right? They go in, they protect these diamond mines, whether it's gold, uranium, all sorts of different precious metals and resources that they can then extract and make money. And you're right, and that's the flow from these mines to Wagner back to the Kremlin. So the Kremlin's basically saying, look, this was us all along. It's really a multi-directional flow, and it's now, I guess, a tug of war between Vladimir Putin, Prigozhin, all these different competing entities to see who's going to pick up the pieces, right? Who's going to now command what's grown into this multinational conglomerate that, again, the Russians need. This isn't, this isn't a nice to have. This is a must have to bring them into the fold to continue business as usual. And I think, business as usual is going to be impossible. There's definitely going to be a disruption in operations. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has come out trying to reassure many of these African leaders, look, we're staying there, we're continuing operations, but everybody's now tracking, flight patterns, seeing, are these guys going anywhere? Are we seeing significant movement either into or out of the country? So, really the next couple of weeks are going to be a very pivotal moment, I think. But at the same time, you've got a power struggle happening at home, an increasingly paranoid Putin who may very well look to purge aspects of his inner circle. So it's among the most fascinating times to be looking at this problem set, and another reason I'm so happy to be here today having this discussion.
You touched on something in your last comment that I kind of wanted to pull the thread on, which is the dynamic between regular Russian soldiers or professional Russian soldiers and the Wagnerites or the Wagner mercenaries. We've heard reports, particularly in Syria, that there was a bit of animosity between the two sets of forces, that sometimes they're seen as sellouts or perhaps shedding negative light on the Russian MOD. So I'm curious if you can kind of talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, I think that dynamic's not unique to Russia, right? I mean, let's go back to the American example of Blackwater, which I think we all remember, right? These were individuals that were fighting under a private contract, making many times over what an enlisted U.S. military, man or woman would make. So there is that sense of, wait a minute, they're doing the same job, right? And maybe not as well, and making a lot more money. Wagner, despite the fact that mercenarying is illegal in Russia, right? They recruit openly with billboards and sophisticated social media campaigns. So there's definitely a bit of tension there. And then I would go back to the incident in, I think it was February 2018 in Syria, where the United States got some intelligence that a large convoy of troops was advancing on Deir ez-Zor, where we had special forces soldiers. They sent a warning on the deconfliction line to the Russians of saying, hey, can you stop whatever convoy is headed our way? And the Russians essentially said, they're not our guys. The U.S. responded, well, they're speaking Russian, so I think they are. And the Russians said, nope, not our guys. And the U.S. subsequently went on to kill reportedly many hundreds of these individuals pretty quickly. And actually a friend of mine was part of that force and said, it could have been far worse. We kind of were merciful toward them. And then there was a lot of dispute over, what exactly happened there, right? Was that the Russians basically teaching Wagner, the Russian MOD, a lesson? You're getting too big for your britches? Was it something, more fundamentally, nefarious? We don't really know. But it's that, and then all of these issues on top of it, compounded by this growing divide, and then playing out in Ukraine. Who gets credit, right? Is it Wagner? Is it some of these other entities? And you see increasingly over time, Prigozhin getting on his media apparatus and sending out these really just profanity-laced diatribes against Shoigu and Gerasimov. And you have to think to yourself, how long could this go on? Even if, and people say, well, Putin likes to have his underlings fight each other. Truly in a kind of Game of Thrones, or for those that have watched Succession, right? That style of entertainment. But it also makes Putin look weak. The Russians look incoherent. I think, there's all sorts of negative effects that result from that. And I think, clearly where things led to an event that I don't even think Putin could have foreseen. And, his reaction to it shows that he wasn't expecting it. There's little strategy behind it. The fact that Prigozhin was allowed to leave alive kind of granted clemency. Wagnerites were allowed to either sign a contract to join the Russian military, which is also what partly precipitated this revolt, or go to Belarus. I think it's very much Russian policy being made on the fly, almost day by day. It seems very reactive, and it seems to shatter this image of omnipotence and strength that Putin has worked very hard over decades to cultivate.
Yeah, it's not a good look. So I want to kind of ask the elephant in the room question, which is, what do you think transpired, on Friday and Saturday, and to some extent Sunday? What dynamics do you think led Prigozhin to take the actions that he did? And by that I mean to initiate the March for Justice, quote unquote, and to turn on a dime and decide, you know what, I'm going to pack up and move my forces out of Rostov-on-Don and take my plane to Belarus. Maybe.
I think this is something that at least Prigozhin had been planning for some time. And we know that it wasn't a spur of the moment decision, because it's now in open source reporting that U.S. intelligence picked up on this when the Russians didn't, in fact, and decided to actually not engage, right, to kind of back off and say, look, we don't want to be accused of meddling or staging this like the U.S. has been accused of meddling in all the color revolutions and in and around the former Soviet sphere of influence. And so I think the U.S. very much backed off, let this play out. But I remember when I was watching this unfold, I know this might be a strange analogy, and this movie may even be unfamiliar to some of you, but there's a movie called Old School with Will Ferrell. And there's a part where he's running, he's streaking through the street, and his wife sees him and she says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "We're streaking, come on everyone, come with me." But he's actually alone, he's running alone, and I thought, that's kind of what Prigozhin is right now. Come on, we're storming Moscow. Everybody, come on, let's go. And initially, there was some momentum there. They started moving through Rostov-on-Don, parts of southern Russia. People were kind of coming out, giving them water and food. And then he kind of said, as they were encroaching on Moscow, come on, guys, where is everybody? This support that he thought he would have, perhaps he was back-channeling to people to kind of pave the way, which is why they saw, less opposition than you would have imagined for a marauding force going into Russia. And it became clear to him that he was in a jam. And, the deal maker that Prigozhin is, he started making calls. And one of those people, to my surprise, that was actually able to broker the deal was Lukashenko, not somebody that I would necessarily put at the top of my list of people, A, that was savvy, or B, was kind of influential enough to be a deal maker. He's often painted as Putin's lapdog, right?
Or a peacemaker, for that matter.
Right, and he's kind of able to pull this out, find a solution that works for everybody, allows the Kremlin to save face, allows Prigozhin to live at least another day. Although I'm with you, I wouldn't necessarily be lining up to sell him life insurance. In fact, I wonder if there's Vegas odds on this. There probably is these days. There's an app where you can actually see how long this guy might live, and was able to kind of salvage this. But really, to me, Prigozhin's days were always numbered. I think Putin's the bigger loser here, because it really, I'm wondering what the conversations are in Tehran and Beijing, right? And some of these other capitals where people thought Putin was their guy. Are they now backing on that a little bit? Are there plans for what comes next after Putin? I think I've heard more people having that discussion within the last few days than I've heard in a really long time, right? And so I wonder, how tarnished is his legitimacy, and does that start to kind of corrode or crumble from within? And again, I made a comment on Twitter that, that kind of went viral, which was, there's a lot of cheerleading from the West about what's happening right now, but I think we need to take a step back and kind of, dampen our enthusiasm a little bit, because a civil war in a country with that many nuclear weapons is never a good thing for anybody, right? And moreover, and I think, this is a lesson the Israelis have learned, sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, right? You don't know who's coming up next behind Putin. Perhaps it's Putin times 2, but 35 years old, and we have to deal with that I'm going to watch my language, person for another 30 years, right? We don't know who's kind of coming up the pike. Is it a more hardened ultra-nationalist who's actually more savvy? So that's something I do lose sleep over, internal instability in Russia, in a country that has that many nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you'll forgive me for putting on my Rand researcher hat for a moment, not moderator, but I think to your point, not only did Putin lose in this, but I think some of the intelligence services really are losing out, right? The FSB, their sole job is essentially to be able to predict these kinds of insurrections and, frankly, challenges to Putin's power. They really failed on that account over the weekend, and also failed on that account initially in February of 2022 and February 2014 to really identify what the motivations of the Ukrainians were, what the likelihood that the Ukrainians would resist Russian forces pretty severely. And so I think, to your point, we might see a little bit of the changing of the Praetorian Guard, potentially. So I'll ask, we've talked a little bit about this, but how, assuming that Wagner is allowed to operate from Belarus, and we've heard some murmurings in the last couple of hours that they might actually be witnessing buildings being actually constructed for Wagner in Belarus. Man, they work fast. But assuming that's the case, and we don't know that it is, how likely is it that they're going to be able to continue their operations in the Middle East and in Africa, and frankly, maybe even win new contracts, let's say in South America? Is that likely, given how entrenched they are in the Russian sort of system?
Again, I think that's the question I've been grappling with, and many others, which is it possible to remove Prigozhin, install a new head of Wagner, call it a new name, whatever, and go on with business as usual? Or does the conflict between the Wagnerites and the Russian MOD run so deep that it goes down to the mid-level commanders, to the foot soldiers? Do they now kind of have their own identity or esprit de corps where they wouldn't want to consider, going into Russian MOD, even though many of these guys, the non-convicts of the world, were at some point, right? Before they became mercenaries. So it's a very kind of tangled web. I was reading something just before walking over here about, does Wagner now just become basically Lukashenko's kind of Praetorian Guard, right? Do they kind of replace some of these folks in Belarus, and they kind of contain to that part of the world? But again, these operations in Africa, if you followed at all the Discord leaks, right, the leaks that we know that came out following the U.S. Air National Guardsmen from Massachusetts that leaked all this information, we learned a lot about Wagner's activities in Africa, and frankly, they're more ubiquitous than we even knew. And they were engaged in a broader range of activities than we even knew. They apparently were trying to make headway in Haiti, right? So not in the Western Hemisphere, where they're already in Venezuela. They're far more ambitious than we gave them credit for, and I think that's something that's not going to go away, and it's clearly driven by demand. And I think, as Russia continues to suffer these missteps, which could be multiplied by a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, they're going to be desperate, and they're going to continue to need to do these types of things to keep the regime afloat, to keep money coming in. And so it's not going to be Prigozhin, but is it some kind of equivalent, someone that could be installed there? I've seen really a whole range of things floated out. Someone said, could they be integrated into the Rosguardia, the National Guard, even though there's a major kind of difference there, both in terms of quality and in terms of mission, right? Could they be subsumed there? So there's all sorts of things that are being floated out there, which just tells you we don't know, right? We really have, in fact, in situations like this, I look to folks like you and your RAND colleagues that study this so closely, real long-time Ukrainian and Russia experts, to get a sense of, what's happening next. I'm looking at this through the lens of violent non-state actors, mercenary groups. How do they function in the world? And Wagner's just grown to be almost a state within a state, right? It's the monopoly on the use of violence or the use of force. And so that power dynamic, to me, has shifted enough. The fact that Prigozhin even attempted to do this shows you just how over his skis he actually ended up being in terms of what he thought Wagner was capable of.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. That's, well, and it's interesting too, to your point about them being potentially folded into Rosgvardia, because again, if we are to believe what Prigozhin said yesterday in his 12-minute diatribe, he said that that was actually one of his goals, was he was negotiating with the senior leadership in the Kremlin to attempt to not, rather than get folded under the MOD, which he thinks is not only corrupt but incapable, to really be folded into another power ministry, another part of the Russian government that he would see as more effective. So that really shows you the level of personality politics there, right?
Big time.
And so I think one of the things that this brings us to is that Wagner's not the only PMC in Russia. It's the one that we talk about the most, perhaps. But in the past several years, we've seen the founding of a number of other oligarchic and semi-state structures, whether that's tied to some of the big...
Patriot.
Yes, exactly, Patriot. So can you talk a little about that landscape, the dynamics going forward, the competition between those other organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, so Russian PMCs, mercenary groups, have proliferated over the past several years. Wagner is the most well-known, but it's hardly the only one. Originally, there was a group called Moran Security, which Utkin was associated with, and many others. We're now seeing that corporations in Russia are developing their own private military companies underneath them. Gazprom is one example, but there's several others. To me, there's this really interesting question, and at the Soufan Center, we put out a report actually on Sunday, of all days, on Wagner. We had been working on it for months, and it was done, and it was going through the very final stages of quality assurance, and this happened, and we thought, well, I guess we have to reframe the introduction to start. And two, it really, I was like, well, that ruined my weekend. It also behooves us to get this out there on the street pretty quickly because it's more relevant than we could have ever imagined. And in the context of this, one of the key findings originally was, and which has now I think maybe been called into question, was that the Wagner model is going to be attractive to other countries because it's actually been quite successful. And other countries use private military contractors. Turkey has developed their own. There's been several others. But is this something that's appealing to a country like China, who looks at this and says, well, it offers plausible deniability. It offers that kind of Swiss Army knife-like capability to do all these different things. The caveat to that now on the back end is make sure that you don't create Frankenstein's monster, right? That you create something that you totally lose control of, which is the situation that Putin is now in, right? So you make this really useful foreign policy tool that then kind of turns around and attacks you, which is probably what's going to happen to us all with artificial intelligence, right? So, but that's a talk for a different day. So how do other countries now look at the utility of a PMC, and how does Russia now go in the other direction of saying, look, we tried this, it backfired, we're now bringing everything in-house, right? The plausible deniability thing was a smokescreen to begin with. No one actually ever really believed they were independent or autonomous. I certainly never did. Now we're telling you as much, haha, the joke's over, let's go on with business as usual. But so much has changed here, and I think other countries may look at this as an opportunity to kind of replicate the success that Wagner's had while also trying to insulate themselves from some of the vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and I think your prediction might sort of ring true with the way that the Russian government has gone, for the last 15 years, which is increased centralization of power and increased paranoia.
Yeah, it's an interesting combo.
Yeah, right. It makes for interesting times. I want to do a time check because I want to make sure that we're still...
Spencer?
5 minutes. Okay, great. I want to ask, since we've only got 5 minutes, what didn't I ask you that I should have? What is keeping you awake at night when you think about Wagner? I know I haven't slept a lot in the last 72 hours, so I imagine you haven't either.
That's a great question. It's something that I don't know that it keeps me up in the sense of that I'm So usually when you get that question, what keeps you up awake at night, it's in terms of U.S. national security. This keeps me up awake at night, but more in a moral sense. And I wonder if this group is ever going to be held accountable for the alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. And if not, what kind of tone does that set? What example does that set for other private military contractors, other entities that are out there operating in a similar way? We know that the International Criminal Court has listed Vladimir Putin, right? He's now they have an arrest warrant for him. I doubt he'll ever see The Hague. But what about some of these other individuals that have been the Mora massacre in Mali, some of the things that have happened in Central African Republic? And it's written off, and it's a shame because it makes, page A17 of the New York Times when some African civilians are slaughtered. Meanwhile, if one person is stabbed in Paris, we're talking about it for days. I'm going on CNN. So I think there's a double standard in the international community in terms of who are the victims, and that's something that I struggle with when I lay awake at night and think about what is this all for? We're writing these reports, we're going on all these shows and talking about this, but at the end of the day, if there's no accountability, because I have the answer to what keeps me awake at night used to be 2 little daughters, right? Literally as infants, crying and keeping me awake. Now they're 4 and 7 years old, and I think, what kind of world are they going to grow up in? And they ask me, they say, Daddy, what is your job? And my wife's like, do not get into that. Please do not. Keep the door closed when you're on interviews. I don't have to explain a lot of these things. But I do try to tell them, I say, there's bad people in the world without getting too dystopian. And I think, as they get older, one of the things I'd like to be able to tell them is that there is justice in the world, there is accountability, and when bad people do bad things, we've said never again, but we really mean it this time in different ways. So I think that's something that I struggle with, and I don't know that we'll get there, and that bothers me.
Well, I think that was a pretty elegant way to wrap up our discussion, but we welcome questions, please.
Hi, Norman Peterson. Thank you very much for all of that. You talked about Wagner as being a Swiss Army knife, and talked about them as being a conglomerate. Did you study their organizational structure in detail so that you could reach a determination as to whether, Prigozhin was the kingpin, he gets a good dose of Novichok and there he goes, and there goes Wagner, or does it have an institutional structure so that it can survive a major player like Prigozhin leaving the scene?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think some of the best work on this has probably been done by places like RAND. There's some other really interesting places out there too. There's a place called All Eyes on Wagner, which I think is a French NGO. Look, all this stuff is hard to find, this information. It's obfuscated. We do dig very deep. We look really closely at, I'll give you, for example, I'm looking at operations in the Central African Republic right now. But it's shell company on top of shell company on top of front company related to an obscure timber company that's importing heavy machinery. It's basically, and there are people that do this for a full-time job, right? This is like one of 4 projects I'm looking at. I wish I could investigate this full-time. So we're putting these pieces together. There's drips and drabs of it, but it's surreptitious by nature, right? But there's also amazing what we call OSINT these days, open source intelligence. So we're able to get pictures. And the best part is that we still live in the TMI generation, too much information. Even Russian mercenaries like to share things on Facebook. This is good news for people like me, right? Because we can get tail numbers of planes. We can see, because what's the point of being a mercenary if you can't take a cool picture with your buddy in Bangui, like with your thumb up, right? And okay, now we know who that guy is. Thank you very much, Sergey. Right? And so there's all these different ways to collect information and data, and rest assured we're attempting to do that. So are a lot of other places, including our intelligence community and many others around the world. But it's if they could just post a nice, neat, clean org chart on a website, I'd be very much obliged. I don't think that's in the cards, unfortunately.
But no mention of the Russian people, the population. What do they think? Do they think? Do they know what's going on? It's the media is run by the state. And how do you think the Russian people are feeling about this, and what could they do about it?
Thank you, and I'll probably hand the microphone to Alyssa to answer this as well, because she's a deep expert in this area. Yeah, to know what the Russian people truly think, I'd love to know the answer to that. Look, these are people whose children are fighting and dying in a war that they're not really sure what it's for. It's been painted as existential when it's anything but, and I think it's probably reminiscent of some other overseas adventures like Afghanistan, where you really saw kind of, I think it was mothers that had kind of banded together to raise their voice in a country where raising your voice is typically not welcome. But again, the fact that some of these videos from southern Russia show people chanting Wagner's name probably shows you that there's some deep-seated grievances. I saw an interview on NBC this morning of a gentleman in Moscow. I think Keir Simmons was the host, and they were basically asking him, you could tell how nervous he was just talking on camera. He kept looking around, looked like a regular, ordinary guy, and he just said, none of this is normal. This is very abnormal, and he kind of pointed back to his son. He said, we don't really want to live like this, and then kind of the interview stopped. So I would love to know what ordinary Russians think. The fascinating part to me about a lot of this is that, and again, please feel free to correct anything I'm saying or to weigh in, because you are a true expert in this area. Russian military bloggers seem to have a sense of kind of a longer leash. They're reporting a lot on things that are happening, and they're often doing it in a way that's accurate and not necessarily flattering to the Kremlin. And yet they're still allowed to kind of do this. It's one source of information that we get that we try to triangulate with other things that we know. And these guys are out there, and there's some pretty popular ones. Again, it's amazing what's out in the open source these days if you know where to look, if you're on vKontakte and some of these other kind of Telegram channels where everyone's telling you exactly what's going on. Wagner has their own Telegram channel, right? It was like when we were looking at what was happening in Raqqa and Mosul, like the Islamic State is telling us, they're videotaping us, they want us to know what's happening. But to get a true sense of the kind of pulse of the Russian population, I don't know, but perhaps you have a better answer.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things to pick up on that you mentioned, one of which is in terms of the Russian military bloggers. I suspect that part of the reason that they're allowing them a longer leash is sort of a pressure release valve, right? So there's a lot of pent up, it seems, frustration about the war and how it's going. Particularly, and maybe not the way that we think from a Western lens, right? So I think there's frustration that it's not going better, that more resources aren't committed, and so those are opinions that are projected on these blogs, and ones that I think the regime is allowing to happen, and they think it's better to vent those opinions that way as opposed to maybe publicly and more broadly. In terms of your question about the Russian public more broadly, your point about us not having great sources is a good one, but we do have some notions. And so there's a lot of videos coming out of Russia where folks, very brave folks, are doing interviews on the streets. And there's one gentleman in particular, I've watched hundreds of his videos, where he goes around, interviews Russians, across the spectrum of age, of various demographics all around the country, and ask questions, relatively pointed questions about the state of the war, the state of the political environment, and really people's opinions. I would say people don't necessarily answer always authentically, because there's of course concerns in doing so. But what I was really struck by is the perception now that people have said, even young people, I was really against the war when it first broke, but now I see that we've committed, and so now I'm committed, and we have to win. So there's this mentality of we have to win, and we have to win decisively, because our future as young people depends on doing so, because our future is so closely tied to the regime. So,
are those people that are part of the political and economic elite, are these kind of St. Petersburg Muscovites, or?
No, from what I've seen, it's all over the country. So folks, very much blue-collar folks, all the way up to the elites.
Interesting.
We're looking at 18-year-olds to 80-year-olds.
Wow.
So that's, granted, there are of course exceptions, and this is not necessarily, this is anecdotal reporting,
Sure, yeah.
but still, it's kind of
Better
a
than
marked
nothing.
trend. Yeah.
Looks like that was our last question, so I'm going to turn it back over to Kim.
Please join me in thanking Colin. Such a timely, sobering, and informative conversation. So I think we could go on with this, but I know everybody has busy lives that they need to go to. But thank you so much, and we hope to bring you back because this is a continuing story. So thank you.
Certainly.